The whispers started the day Nathaniel Crane arrived at Fairhaven Plantation in South Carolina with a woman nobody could quite understand. It was March 1838, and the plantation had been without a master for 6 months since old Thomas Whitmore died without heirs. The property, 300 acres of cotton fields and tobacco, along with 47 enslaved people, had been sold at auction to pay debts. Nathaniel Crane, a mysterious man from Boston with obvious wealth but unclear origins, had purchased it sight unseen. The neighboring plantation owners gathered to meet him, curious about the northerner who'd bought southern property. What they found confused and disturbed them. Nathaniel Crane was in his early 40s, tall and scholarly looking, with graying hair and intelligent eyes. He dressed well but simply, spoke with a cultured Boston accent, and carried himself with quiet authority. Nothing about him seemed unusual, until people met the woman he introduced as Miss Abigail. Abigail was a black woman, approximately 30 years old, of medium height with sharp, intelligent features and eyes that seemed to see right through people. She was introduced not as a slave, not as a servant, but simply as Miss Abigail, who manages my household and advises me on all matters of importance. She was dressed as well as any white woman of means, a fine wool dress, proper shoes, her hair styled elegantly. She spoke with education and confidence. And most shockingly, she sat at the dining table with Crane when he entertained visitors, participating in conversations as an equal. The neighboring planters were horrified. Mr. Crane, one of them, a man named Harrison Webb, said carefully, "I notice your servant dines with you. That's quite unusual for our region." "Miss Abigail is not a servant," Crane replied calmly. "She is my most trusted advisor and the person I respect most in this world. Of course she dines with me. But she's a negress," another planter said bluntly. "In South Carolina, colored people, enslaved or free, do not dine with white people. It's simply not done." "Then I shall be the first to do it," Crane said pleasantly. "Gentlemen, I appreciate your concern, but how I run my household is my affair. Miss Abigail stays." The meeting ended awkwardly, and the planters left muttering about northern arrogance and dangerous ideas. But the strangeness at Fairhaven didn't end with dinner arrangements. Over the following weeks, the enslaved people on surrounding plantations began hearing remarkable stories from those at Fairhaven. The new master didn't use overseers. He didn't permit whipping. He paid wages, actual money, to the enslaved people for their work. He'd built a school on the property and required all children to attend. And most shocking of all, he consulted with Miss Abigail on every decision, deferring to her judgment on matters large and small. "It's like he worships her," one enslaved man reported after visiting Fairhaven to deliver a message. "Like she's some kind of queen and he's her servant, not the other way around." The white community was scandalized. They demanded explanations. They pressured Crane to conform to local customs. They threatened social ostracism. Crane ignored them all. But one person watched Fairhaven with particular interest, a woman named Rebecca Morrison, the widow of a plantation owner who lived on the neighboring property. Rebecca was 42 years old, intelligent and observant, and she'd spent 2 decades quietly questioning the system of slavery while outwardly conforming to it. Rebecca had inherited her late husband's plantation and its 20 enslaved people. She ran it as humanely as the system allowed, but she still participated in slavery, still owned people, still profited from their labor. The guilt ate at her conscience daily. When she heard about the unusual arrangements at Fairhaven, Rebecca decided to investigate for herself. She called on Nathaniel Crane under the pretense of welcoming a new neighbor. Crane received her graciously in the plantation house parlor. And as Rebecca had heard, Miss Abigail was present, not standing in a corner like a servant, but seated in a chair, participating in the conversation. "Mrs. Morrison, it's a pleasure to meet you," Crane said. "May I introduce Miss Abigail Freeman? She manages Fairhaven and has been my closest companion for many years." Rebecca studied the woman carefully. Abigail met her gaze directly, something enslaved people were trained never to do with white people. But there was no defiance in Abigail's eyes, only calm confidence. "Freeman," Rebecca said carefully. "Is that your surname?" "It is," Abigail replied. "I am a free woman, Mrs. Morrison. I have been free for 12 years. Rebecca's surprise must have shown on her face, because Crane smiled slightly. "I see the confusion. Let me explain, as I should have explained to the other visitors but lacked the patience. Miss Abigail was born enslaved on a plantation in Maryland. 12 years ago, when she was 18, I purchased her freedom and emancipated her legally. Since then, she has been my business partner, advisor, and dearest friend." "You purchased a slave and freed her?" Rebecca asked, trying to understand. "Why?" Crane and Abigail exchanged a glance, as if deciding how much to reveal. Finally, Abigail spoke. "Mr. Crane was a visitor to the plantation where I was enslaved. He saw me being beaten by an overseer for the crime of knowing how to read. My mother had taught me secretly. Mr. Crane intervened, demanded to purchase me, and the master agreed. That same day, Mr. Crane took me to a lawyer and had me legally freed." "But that was 12 years ago," Rebecca said. "And you've been together since then?" "Yes," Crane said simply. Abigail proved to have a remarkable mind for business. "We became partners in several ventures in Boston. When I decided to purchase a southern plantation, she insisted on coming with me." "Why?" Rebecca asked, directing the question to Abigail. "Why would a free black woman voluntarily come to South Carolina, where slavery is even harsher than Maryland?" Abigail's expression grew serious. "Because slavery is evil, Mrs. Morrison. And the only way to fight evil is to confront it directly. Mr. Crane and I have a plan, to prove that a plantation can be profitable without the brutality of slavery, without the dehumanization and violence. If we can demonstrate that, perhaps others will follow our example." Rebecca felt something shift inside her. "You're trying to end slavery by example." "We're trying to show there's another way," Crane corrected. "Whether it ends slavery or simply reduces its cruelty, we believe the attempt is worth making." Over the following months, Rebecca became a frequent visitor to Fairhaven. She watched how Crane and Abigail ran the plantation, with wages instead of whips, with education instead of enforced ignorance, with dignity instead of degradation. The enslaved people at Fairhaven were still not free. South Carolina law made immediate mass emancipation nearly impossible without the freed people leaving the state. But they lived differently than enslaved people on other plantations. They had Sundays off. They received medical care. Their families were never separated. Children attended school. Adults were encouraged to learn trades. And over everything, Abigail presided with quiet authority. She made decisions about planting schedules, about which crops to grow, about how to manage resources. Crane deferred to her judgment consistently. "People say you worship her," Rebecca said to Crane one afternoon when Abigail was out inspecting the tobacco fields. "They say it's unnatural, the way you elevate a black woman above yourself." Crane looked at Rebecca seriously. "I don't worship Abigail. But I respect her more than any person I've ever known. She's brilliant, courageous, and morally clear in a way I've never been. When I met her, I was a wealthy man who'd never questioned the world I inherited. She opened my eyes to the horror of slavery. Working with her has been the greatest privilege of my life." "Are you in love with her?" Rebecca asked bluntly. Crane smiled. "Does it matter? In South Carolina, such a relationship would be illegal and dangerous. But yes, I love her. Not in the way society recognizes between man and wife, but as the person who gave my life meaning and purpose." "Is that worship?" "Perhaps. But if so, she's worthy of worship." Rebecca left that conversation shaken. She went home to her own plantation, looked at the 20 people she owned, and felt ashamed. If Nathaniel Crane, a white man with all the privilege in the world, could recognize Abigail's humanity and worth. What excuse did Rebecca have for continuing to own people? But the neighboring planters were less philosophical. They saw Fairhaven as a threat, a dangerous example that undermined the entire system of slavery. And they began plotting ways to destroy it. The first attack was economic. The planters organized a boycott, refusing to do business with Crane. They wouldn't buy his crops, wouldn't sell him supplies, wouldn't allow their enslaved people to interact with Fairhaven's people. Crane responded by selling his crops directly to northern buyers and importing supplies from Charleston. The boycott hurt but didn't break him. The second attack was legal. The planters filed complaints with the county, claiming that Crane was violating laws requiring enslaved people to have white supervision, laws forbidding the education of enslaved people, laws regulating how plantations should be run. Crane hired lawyers who argued that technically, he was following the law, the enslaved people had white supervision, him, and the school was his private property where he could do as he wished. The complaints were dismissed. The third attack was social. The planters spread rumors that Crane and Abigail were engaged in an illicit relationship, that Fairhaven was a den of immorality, that Crane was mentally unstable. Crane ignored the rumors. But Abigail felt the weight of them. She knew that in the South, a black woman accused of improper relations with a white man, even a free black woman, could face violence or worse. "Perhaps I should leave," Abigail told Crane one evening. "Go back to Boston. Your experiment would have a better chance without me as a target for their hatred." "The experiment isn't mine, it's ours," Crane replied firmly. "And Abigail, you're not leaving. We're in this together." But the planters' fourth attack was the most dangerous, and it targeted Abigail directly. One night in September, 6 months after Crane arrived at Fairhaven, a group of white men rode onto the plantation. They wore no masks, they weren't trying to hide their identities. They were the neighboring planters and their sons, and they'd come to put things right. They found Abigail in the plantation house, working on accounts. Crane was away in Charleston on business. "You need to leave, negress," Harrison Webb said, his tone making clear this wasn't a request. "You need to go back north and stop corrupting our way of life." "This is my home," Abigail said, her voice steady despite her fear. "And I'm not leaving." "You think you're better than us," another man said. "You think you can sit at white men's tables, run a plantation, act like you're equal. You're not. You're a nigger, and it's time you remembered that." They grabbed her, dragged her outside, and tied her to a post. They were going to whip her, to teach her her place, to show what happened to black women who got above themselves. But they didn't know that the enslaved people at Fairhaven had been watching. And unlike enslaved people on other plantations who'd been broken by years of brutality, the people at Fairhaven had been treated with dignity. They'd been educated. They'd been respected. And they weren't going to stand by while Miss Abigail, the woman who'd fought for them, taught them, treated them as human beings, was brutalized. Led by a man named Isaiah, a group of 15 enslaved men emerged from the darkness, carrying tools that could serve as weapons. They positioned themselves around Abigail. "Let her go," Isaiah said firmly. "Or there will be trouble." The white men were shocked. Enslaved people didn't confront white men. Didn't threaten. Didn't show defiance. "You're committing rebellion," Webb said. "You'll all be hanged for this." "Maybe," Isaiah replied. "But you'll have to explain to the law why you were trespassing on Mr. Crane's property, assaulting a free woman, and starting a confrontation that left white men dead. Because that's what will happen if you don't leave. We'll fight. And some of you won't walk away." For a tense moment, violence seemed inevitable. Then one of the younger planters, seeing the determination in the enslaved men's faces and the tools in their hands, lost his nerve. "This isn't worth dying over," he muttered. "Let's go." Reluctantly, furiously, the white men released Abigail and rode away. When Crane returned from Charleston the next day and learned what had happened, he was both terrified and grimly determined. This was a warning, he said. They'll try again, and next time they'll be more organized. Abigail, we need to consider whether. No, Abigail interrupted. I'm not leaving. And we're not changing what we're doing. But Nathaniel, we need help. We need allies. We can't fight this alone. Where do we find allies in South Carolina? Crane asked. We find them among people who've been questioning this system all along, Abigail said. She looked at Crane meaningfully. Like Mrs. Morrison. Rebecca Morrison was indeed questioning. And when Abigail and Crane approached her, asking for her support and alliance, Rebecca had to make a choice, continue participating in a system she knew was evil, or stand with the two people trying to change it. She chose to stand with them. But she had no idea how much that choice would cost her, or where it would ultimately lead. Because the planters' attacks were far from over. And what was coming would test everyone's courage to the breaking point. Rebecca Morrison's decision to ally with Nathaniel Crane and Abigail Freeman shocked the white community even more than Crane's original arrival had. A white Southern widow, supporting a Northern man and his freed black partner. It was betrayal. It was madness. It was unforgivable. The social consequences were immediate. Rebecca was excluded from church services. Her friends stopped calling. The merchants in town refused to sell to her. She received anonymous letters calling her a nigger lover and a traitor to her race. But Rebecca had made her choice, and she didn't waver. I've spent 20 years living a lie, she told Abigail during one of their planning meetings at Fairhaven. 20 years knowing slavery was wrong but being too afraid to say it. I'm done being afraid. The three of them, Crane, Abigail, and Rebecca, began working together to create what they called the Fairhaven model. The goal was to demonstrate that a plantation could be both profitable and humane, that treating enslaved people with dignity didn't mean economic ruin. They kept meticulous records showing productivity, costs, and profits. They documented that workers who were paid, educated, and treated with respect actually produced more than workers who were beaten and terrorized. They proved that keeping families together improved morale and work quality. They demonstrated that investing in people's welfare, providing medical care, adequate food, decent housing, reduced long-term costs. We're building evidence, Abigail explained to the people at Fairhaven during one of the community meetings she held every Sunday. Evidence that will prove slavery isn't just morally wrong, it's economically unnecessary. If we can show that, we give people who want to end slavery a powerful argument. But the neighboring planters saw the Fairhaven model as a threat, not an opportunity. And they intensified their campaign to destroy it. They filed more legal complaints. They spread more rumors. They pressured anyone who did business with Fairhaven to stop. And they began targeting the enslaved people themselves. In November 1838, a teenage girl from a neighboring plantation ran away and sought refuge at Fairhaven. Her name was Sarah, and she was fleeing from her master who'd been sexually abusing her. She arrived at Fairhaven beaten and terrified, begging for help. Abigail brought her inside, treated her wounds, and gave her sanctuary. But legally, Sarah was a fugitive slave, and her master, a cruel man named Thomas Richmond, had the right to retrieve her. Richmond arrived at Fairhaven the next day with the sheriff and a legal warrant for Sarah's return. The girl is my property, Richmond said. I have legal right to her. Hand her over. Abigail stood in the doorway, blocking entry to the house. She's a human being who's been brutalized. I won't hand her over to more abuse. You don't have a choice, the sheriff said. The law is clear. She's a slave, she ran away, and she must be returned. What if we purchase her? Crane suggested, emerging from the house. Mr. Richmond, I'll give you twice her market value. Name your price. Richmond smiled cruelly. She's not for sale. Not to you. I know what you're trying to do here, corrupt the natural order, fill slaves' heads with ideas above their station. I won't contribute to that by selling you my property. Then we're at an impasse, Crane said quietly. Because we won't hand over a terrified child to a man who's been raping her. The sheriff's hand moved to his pistol. Mr. Crane, you're interfering with legal property return. That's a crime. Step aside, or I'll arrest you. For a moment, it seemed violence was inevitable. Then Rebecca Morrison's carriage appeared on the road, and she climbed down carrying papers. Sheriff, before you arrest anyone, you should know that I've just filed formal complaints with the county judge documenting Mr. Richmond's abuse of his enslaved people, Rebecca said. Multiple witnesses have testified to seeing him beat his workers nearly to death, starve them, and force himself on young girls. While slavery is legal, cruelty has limits even under South Carolina law. I'm requesting a formal investigation. It was a bluff, Rebecca had no such witnesses and no filed complaints. But the sheriff didn't know that. And Richmond looked panicked, because some of what Rebecca described was true. This is nonsense, Richmond blustered. Lies from Northern sympathizers. Then you won't mind an investigation, Rebecca said calmly. In the meantime, Sarah stays at Fairhaven under protective custody until the matter is resolved. The sheriff looked between Richmond's guilty face and Rebecca's confident one. He made a calculation. Getting into a shooting fight with a respected white widow over a slave girl wasn't worth the trouble, especially if there might actually be an investigation. Fine, he said. The girl stays here temporarily. But Mr. Richmond, you'd better be prepared to defend yourself against these allegations. After they left, Rebecca sagged with relief. That won't hold them off for long. Maybe a week. What do we do with Sarah? We get her to freedom, Abigail said. The Underground Railroad operates in South Carolina. We find a contact, we get Sarah to a conductor, and we get her north. That's illegal, Rebecca pointed out. If we're caught helping a fugitive slave escape, we could face serious criminal charges. I know, Abigail said. But what's the alternative? Hand her back to Richmond. Let her be raped and beaten until she's used up and discarded. I won't do that. Crane looked at both women. This is different from running Fairhaven differently. This is actively breaking the law. Rebecca, you don't have to be involved. This isn't your fight. Yes it is, Rebecca said firmly. The moment I allied with you, I made it my fight. Let's find Sarah a way out. Over the next week, using careful inquiries and discreet contacts, they located a conductor on the Underground Railroad, a free black man named William who operated a blacksmith shop in Charleston and helped fugitive slaves escape to the north. William came to Fairhaven at night to meet Sarah and plan her escape. He was cautious and suspicious at first, and used to white people offering help rather than threats. Why are you doing this? He asked Abigail directly. You're free, you could live comfortably in the north. Why risk everything for a girl you don't even know? Because I was that girl once, Abigail said. 18 years old, being beaten for knowing how to read, facing a future of brutality and degradation. Someone saved me. Now I save others when I can. William studied her, then nodded. Sarah can travel with a group leaving in 3 days. But you need to get her to Charleston without raising suspicion. That's the hard part. They devised a plan. Rebecca would transport Sarah hidden in her carriage under the pretense of traveling to Charleston for shopping. Once there, she'd deliver Sarah to William's blacksmith shop. But the plan fell apart when Thomas Richmond, suspicious of the delay, showed up at Fairhaven with a group of armed men demanding Sarah's immediate return. The sheriff's investigation found nothing, Richmond said, though his tone suggested he'd paid to ensure that outcome. The girl is mine. Hand her over now, or we'll take her by force. They had Sarah hidden in the plantation house cellar, but Richmond's men were already searching the property. It was only a matter of time before they found her. We need a distraction, Crane said quietly. Something to draw them away from the house. Isaiah, the enslaved man who'd led the defense of Abigail months earlier, overheard. I'll create a distraction. The tobacco barn, if it catches fire, they'll have to respond. Can't let that much value burn. No, Abigail said immediately. That barn represents weeks of work and significant income. We need it. We need Sarah's freedom more, Isaiah replied. Miss Abigail, you've taught us that human lives matter more than property. Let me prove I learned that lesson. Before anyone could stop him, Isaiah ran to the tobacco barn and set it ablaze. The fire spread rapidly, and Richmond's men immediately rushed to fight it. Tobacco was valuable, and even Richmond couldn't ignore a major fire. In the chaos, Crane and Rebecca smuggled Sarah out of the cellar and into Rebecca's carriage. Rebecca drove away while the men were distracted by the fire. By the time the fire was extinguished, the barn was a total loss. Sarah was safely away. Richmond was furious. You harbored a fugitive slave. You helped her escape. That's a federal crime under the Fugitive Slave Act. Prove it, Crane said. You can search Fairhaven all you want. You won't find her. Richmond did search, thoroughly and destructively. But Sarah was gone, and there was no evidence she'd been helped to escape rather than simply running away during the confusion of the fire. Unable to prove anything, Richmond left. But his parting words were ominous. You've made powerful enemies, Mr. Crane. This isn't over. The cost of saving Sarah was steep. The tobacco barn loss represented nearly a third of Fairhaven's annual income. And the incident had drawn attention from authorities who were now watching the plantation carefully, looking for evidence of underground railroad activity. But Sarah made it to freedom. William got her north to Pennsylvania, where she started a new life free from Richmond's abuse. And for Abigail, Crane, and Rebecca, that success was worth every cost. We can't keep doing this, Rebecca said at a meeting 2 weeks later. We can't save every runaway slave who comes here. We don't have the resources, and the authorities are watching too closely. You're right, Abigail agreed. We can't save everyone. But we saved Sarah. And maybe we can save a few more. Isn't that worth the risk? Rebecca thought about the question. She thought about 20 years of moral compromise, of participating in evil while telling herself she was powerless to change it. She thought about Sarah, terrified and broken, now free and healing. Yes, Rebecca said. It's worth the risk. But the risks were escalating. Richmond and the other planters were organizing, planning something bigger than individual acts of harassment. They'd decided that Fairhaven and everyone associated with it had to be destroyed completely. And they were willing to use violence to do it. The attack came on a cold night in December. 20 armed men, planters and their sons, along with hired thugs, rode onto Fairhaven property with torches and weapons. They planned to burn the plantation house, scatter the enslaved people, and teach Crane and his nigger mistress a lesson they wouldn't forget. But they didn't know that the people at Fairhaven had been preparing for exactly this kind of attack. That Crane had armed the enslaved men and trained them to defend the property. That Abigail had organized a warning system and defense plan. When the raiders approached, they were met not with terrified victims but with organized resistance. Isaiah and 15 other men, armed with rifles Crane had purchased, positioned themselves around the plantation house. When the raiders came within range, Isaiah called out a warning, "This is private property. You're trespassing. Turn back now, or we'll defend ourselves. You're slaves." Richmond shouted from the darkness. "You can't threaten white men. We're human beings defending our home," Isaiah replied. "And we will shoot if you don't leave." Richmond, emboldened by numbers and whiskey, ordered his men to attack. They charged the house, firing weapons and throwing torches. The enslaved men fired back. The battle lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt like hours. When it was over, 3 of the raiders were wounded, 1 seriously. None of Fairhaven's defenders were hurt, though several buildings had minor fire damage. The raiders retreated, carrying their wounded. But everyone knew this was a turning point. Armed enslaved people had fired on white men. In South Carolina in 1838, that was unthinkable. The consequences would be severe. By morning, a militia had been organized. The county sheriff, backed by armed volunteers, came to Fairhaven to arrest the rebellious slaves who'd attacked white citizens. Crane met them at the gate. "No one here attacked anyone. We defended our property from armed raiders who came onto our land intending violence. South Carolina law allows property defense. South Carolina law does not allow niggers to shoot at white men," the sheriff said. "Hand over the men who fired weapons, or I'll arrest everyone on this plantation." "You'll arrest no one," said a new voice. Everyone turned to see a well-dressed older man stepping down from an expensive carriage. He was perhaps 60 years old, with white hair and an authoritative bearing. "Judge Blackwell," the sheriff said, clearly surprised. "What are you doing here?" "Preventing an injustice," Judge Marcus Blackwell said. He was one of the most respected jurists in South Carolina, and his presence immediately changed the dynamic. "I've reviewed the facts of this case. Mr. Crane's property was attacked by armed men who intended arson and violence. His workers defended the property lawfully. The raiders were the criminals here, not the defenders." "But Your Honor, they're slaves," the sheriff began. "They're human beings who had every right to protect themselves and their home," Blackwell interrupted. "Now, unless you have evidence of actual crimes committed by anyone at Fairhaven, and trespassing raiders don't count as evidence, you'll leave this property immediately." The sheriff, outranked and outmaneuvered, had no choice but to comply. The militia dispersed, and Fairhaven was safe, for the moment. After everyone left, Crane approached Judge Blackwell. "Thank you, Your Honor. But why did you intervene? You don't know us." Blackwell looked at Abigail, who'd been standing quietly nearby. "Miss Freeman, we met once before, 12 years ago in Maryland. I was the lawyer who processed your emancipation papers. I've followed your story since then with interest. When I heard about Fairhaven and what you and Mr. Crane were attempting, I knew I had to help if the opportunity arose." He turned to Crane. "What you're doing here is dangerous and possibly doomed to fail. But it's also right. And in a system as evil as slavery, I've learned to support those who fight for what's right, even when the odds are against them." But Blackwell's help came with a warning: "You've made enemies who won't stop. And my influence only goes so far. You need to be prepared for what's coming." What was coming was worse than any of them imagined. Because the planters had decided that if they couldn't destroy Fairhaven through violence or law, they'd destroy it through betrayal. And they'd found the perfect person to betray Abigail, someone from her past who knew secrets she'd never told anyone at Fairhaven. Secrets that, if revealed, could destroy everything she and Crane had built. The man who arrived at Fairhaven in January 1839 introduced himself as Josiah Freeman, and he claimed to be Abigail's brother. Abigail's reaction to seeing him was shock, then fear, then carefully controlled anger. She met with him privately in the plantation house study while Crane waited anxiously outside. "What are you doing here?" Abigail asked quietly. Josiah was in his mid-30s, lighter-skinned than Abigail, with sharp features and calculating eyes. "Is that any way to greet your brother? I haven't seen you in 12 years, Abby." "We're not family," Abigail said coldly. "Not anymore. Not after what you did." "I made a choice," Josiah said with a shrug. "A practical choice. And it seems you made your own choices, interesting ones. Living as a free woman with a white man, running a plantation. You've done well for yourself. Why are you here?" Abigail repeated. Josiah's expression hardened. "I'm here because some important people in South Carolina are very interested in you. They want to know about your past. About who you really are. About secrets you've been keeping from your northern gentleman friend." "You wouldn't dare," Abigail said. "Wouldn't I?" Josiah smiled. "Abby, I've been hired to destroy Fairhaven's reputation and yours. I can do that by revealing the truth about your past. Or, you could pay me to leave. Say, $5,000. That's a bargain for keeping such interesting secrets. I don't have $5,000, Abigail said. But Mr. Crane does, Josiah replied. Talk to him. You have 3 days to decide, pay me, or I start talking to people about the real Abigail Freeman. After Josiah left, Abigail sat alone in the study for nearly an hour before finally calling Crane, Indiana. I need to tell you something, she said quietly. Something I should have told you 12 years ago but was too afraid to share. About who I was before you freed me. Crane sat down, concern evident on his face. Abigail, whatever it is. Let me speak, Abigail interrupted. Please. This is hard enough without interruptions. She took a deep breath and began. When you met me in Maryland, I told you I had been enslaved on that plantation my whole life. That was a lie. I was born on a different plantation in Virginia. My mother was enslaved there, but my father was the plantation master. That makes me what they call a mulatto, mixed race. When I was 10 years old, my white father died. His legitimate son, the new master, didn't want reminders of his father's relationship with an enslaved woman around. So he sold me and my mother south. She paused, gathering courage. We ended up on the Maryland plantation where you found me. My mother died when I was 16. I was alone, grieving, and desperate. That's when I met Josiah. He was the master's son, the legitimate heir, light-skinned enough to pass for white, educated and privileged while I was enslaved and powerless. He's your half-brother, Crane said quietly. Yes. Same father, different mothers. His mother was white and free, mine was enslaved. The difference in our circumstances meant everything. But for a while, when we were children, we were friends. He taught me to read using his school books. He shared his lessons with me. I thought he cared. What happened? Crane asked. When I was 17, the master, Josiah's father and mine, decided to sell me. I begged Josiah to help me, to use his influence with his father to stop the sale. He refused. He said it was natural that I should be sold, that I was property despite our shared blood. He chose his inheritance and privilege over any loyalty to me. Abigail's voice was steady but her hands trembled. That's when I understood that family, blood, none of it mattered compared to race and power. I was sold to another plantation, where I was treated brutally. The overseer who beat me for reading, that's where you found me. You saved me from that hell, Nathaniel. And I've been grateful every day since. But you never told me about Josiah or your father, Crane said. I was ashamed, Abigail admitted. Ashamed of being rejected by my own father and brother. Ashamed of being the product of a master raping an enslaved woman, because even if my mother said she loved him, can love truly exist when one person owns the other? I wanted to leave all of that behind and become someone new. Abigail Freeman, free woman, was who I wanted to be. The enslaved girl rejected by her white family was who I wanted to forget. What is Josiah threatening to reveal? Crane asked. The truth about my parentage. About being the illegitimate daughter of a Virginia plantation master. That I'm mixed race, not fully black. In the South, that matters. It means I've been passing as something I'm not. It raises questions about my relationship with you, whether I'm using my white blood to manipulate you, whether our partnership is really a secret sexual relationship. The rumors will destroy Fairhaven's credibility and possibly endanger us both. Crane was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Is that all? That's the great secret Josiah is threatening to reveal? Abigail looked at him in confusion. Nathaniel, did you hear what I said? I lied to you. I'm not who you thought I was. You're exactly who I thought you were, Crane said firmly. You're Abigail Freeman, the woman who opened my eyes to slavery's evil, who's partnered with me to build something meaningful, who risks her life daily to fight injustice. Whether your father was white or black, whether you're mixed race or not, none of that changes who you are or what we're doing here. But the scandal will happen whether we pay Josiah or not, Crane interrupted. If we pay him off, he'll just come back for more money. Blackmailers always do. And even if we pay, the planters will find other ways to attack us. So we don't pay. We tell the truth ourselves, on our own terms, before Josiah can weaponize it against us. Nathaniel, if we reveal my past, the planters will use it to discredit everything we've done here. Perhaps, Crane acknowledged. Or perhaps it will show that you've overcome even more than people realized. That you were rejected by your own white family, enslaved despite being half white, and still built a life of dignity and purpose. That's not shameful, that's remarkable. Abigail felt tears in her eyes. You're not angry that I lied. I'm sad you felt you had to, Crane said. But angry? No. You owed me no explanations about your past, Abigail. You've more than proven who you are through your actions. They decided to be proactive. Before Josiah could spread his version of Abigail's story, they invited Rebecca Morrison and several other allies to Fairhaven, and Abigail told them the truth herself. Rebecca's reaction was immediate and fierce. Those planters think they can use your past against you. They're wrong. If anything, your story proves what many of us have suspected, that the line between white and black is arbitrary, that families are divided by slavery's evil rules, that the entire system is built on hypocrisy and cruelty. But not everyone reacted so positively. When word spread through the enslaved community at Fairhaven that Abigail was half white, some people felt betrayed. She's been acting like she's one of us, one woman said bitterly. But she's got white blood. She's been passing. She's been lying about who she is, another agreed. The criticism hurt Abigail deeply. She'd spent years building trust with the Fairhaven community, and now some of that trust was damaged. But Isaiah, the man who'd led the defense of the plantation, spoke up at the next community meeting. Miss Abigail's blood doesn't change what she's done. She's fought for us. Taught us. Risked her life for us. White blood, black blood, mixed blood, none of that matters as much as her actions. And her actions have been honorable. Gradually, most of the community came to accept the revelation. But the damage had been done. Josiah had succeeded in creating division and distrust, even without getting paid. The planters used the revelation exactly as Crane had predicted. They spread stories that Abigail had been manipulating Crane using her white blood and feminine wiles, that the whole Fairhaven experiment was a deception, that nothing about Crane and Abigail could be trusted. She's a mulatto passing for black to play on Northern sympathies, Harrison Webb proclaimed at a county meeting. The whole thing is a fraud designed to attack slavery through trickery. The scandal reached newspapers. Some Northern abolitionist papers defended Abigail, saying her mixed heritage made her story even more compelling, proof that slavery destroyed even blood relationships. But Southern papers condemned her as a deceiver and troublemaker. In the midst of this controversy, Josiah returned to Fairhaven. He found Abigail working in the plantation office. "I'm disappointed you didn't pay me," Josiah said. "But I suppose I've caused enough damage anyway. The planters who hired me are satisfied. Why do you hate me so much?" Abigail asked quietly. "We're family, Josiah. We share a father. Why do you want to destroy me?" Josiah's expression flickered, something like pain crossed his face. "You don't understand. You never did. I don't hate you, Abby. I envy you." "Envy me?" Abigail repeated in disbelief. "I was enslaved. You were free and privileged. What could you possibly envy?" "Your freedom from pretense," Josiah said. "I've spent my whole life pretending to be fully white, hiding the fact that I'm mixed race, terrified someone will discover the truth and I'll lose everything. You were enslaved, yes, but you didn't have to lie about who you were. And now you're free and living openly as yourself. I'm still lying, still hiding, still afraid. He looked at her with something approaching longing. When you were freed, I thought about reaching out to you. Thought about trying to build a real relationship as siblings. But I was too afraid. Afraid being connected to you would expose my secret. So I buried those feelings and told myself you didn't matter to me. But I did matter, Abigail said. You did, Josiah admitted. And when the planters offered me money to destroy your reputation, I took it. Not because I wanted to hurt you, but because hurting you proved I wasn't connected to you, proved I was white enough to betray my black sister without feeling anything. But you do feel something, Abigail observed. I feel everything, Josiah said, his voice breaking. I feel shame at what I've done. I feel grief for the relationship we might have had. I feel rage at a system that forced me to choose between acknowledging my sister and maintaining my social position. I feel lost, Abby. I've chosen privilege over family, and it's left me hollow. Abigail studied her brother, this man who'd betrayed her, who'd caused her so much pain, but who was also a victim of the same system that had enslaved her. It's not too late, Abigail said quietly. You could choose differently now. You could stop hiding, stop pretending, stop serving people who'd reject you if they knew your truth. And lose everything I've built? Josiah asked. What have you built that's real? Abigail challenged. A life based on lies? Relationships built on hiding who you are? Is that really worth preserving? Josiah stood there for a long moment, visibly struggling. Then he said, I don't have your courage, Abby. I wish I did. But I'm too afraid of what honesty would cost me. He left Fairhaven that day, and Abigail never saw him again. But she heard, years later, that he'd moved to New York and started living openly as a mixed-race man, that he'd even become involved in abolition work. Whether her words had influenced that change, she never knew. But the damage Josiah had done remained. Fairhaven's reputation was damaged. Donors and supporters who'd been interested in the experiment pulled back. The plantation faced increased legal pressure and economic boycotts. We're losing, Rebecca said at a strategy meeting in February. The scandal has hurt us too badly. People who were on the fence about Fairhaven now see it as a fraud. We're running out of allies and resources. So what do we do? Crane asked. It was Abigail who answered. We double down. We make Fairhaven so successful, so obviously beneficial to everyone involved, that the scandal doesn't matter. We prove through results that what we're doing works. They threw themselves into making the plantation as productive and well-run as possible. The workers, now fully aware of the challenges the plantation faced, worked harder than ever. They brought in a good tobacco crop. They maintained the property beautifully. They ran the school more efficiently. And slowly, results started to speak louder than scandal. Visitors who came to Fairhaven expecting to find chaos and deception instead found a well-run plantation with educated workers, maintained buildings, and profitable operations. They found enslaved people who, while not free, lived with dignity and hope. They found a community that worked together rather than being ruled by fear. The evidence was undeniable, the Fairhaven model worked. But even as Fairhaven was proving its worth, a new threat emerged. And this threat was more dangerous than scandals or boycotts. This threat came from the federal government itself, in the form of the Fugitive Slave Act and the increasing tensions between North and South that would eventually lead to civil war. Fairhaven was about to become a flashpoint in the larger conflict over slavery. And Abigail, Crane, and Rebecca would have to make choices that would test their courage like never before. By the summer of 1840, 2 years after Crane and Abigail arrived in South Carolina, Fairhaven had become famous, or infamous, depending on who was talking about it. Northern abolitionists pointed to it as proof that slavery wasn't necessary for Southern agriculture. Southern defenders of slavery condemned it as a dangerous aberration that undermined the social order. And people on both sides watched it carefully, seeing in Fairhaven's success or failure proof of their own beliefs about slavery's future. But this attention brought pressure that threatened to destroy everything they'd built. The pressure intensified when 3 enslaved people from neighboring plantations ran away and sought refuge at Fairhaven in 1 week in July. All 3 had heard stories about the unusual plantation where enslaved people were treated with dignity, and they desperately wanted to live there instead of under their brutal masters. Legally, Crane was required to return fugitive slaves to their owners. Morally, he couldn't force people back into situations where they'd be beaten or worse. He was trapped between law and conscience. If we harbor them, we're breaking the law and giving the planters ammunition against us, Rebecca pointed out. If we return them, we're betraying everything Fairhaven stands for. There's a third option, Abigail said quietly. We get them to freedom. Like we did with Sarah. 3 people in 1 week. Crane asked. That's too many. We'll be caught. So we do it carefully, Abigail replied. We contact the Underground Railroad. We use multiple routes. We make it impossible to trace. Over the next month, they successfully smuggled all 3 fugitives to freedom. But the effort required was enormous, and the risk was substantial. Fairhaven was now under constant surveillance by authorities looking for evidence of Underground Railroad activity. And then came the crisis that would change everything. In August 1840, a new fugitive arrived at Fairhaven. But this wasn't a runaway from a neighboring plantation. This was a woman named Hannah who'd escaped from a plantation in Georgia, traveling for weeks through dangerous territory to reach the fabled Fairhaven where, rumor said, all people were treated as human beings. Hannah was 28 years old, heavily pregnant, and exhausted from her journey. She collapsed at Fairhaven's gate and was brought inside by workers who found her. Abigail examined her and discovered she was perhaps a week from giving birth. She can't travel, Abigail told Crane. Not in her condition. The journey would kill her and the baby. How long until she can travel safely? Crane asked. At least a month after the baby's born. Maybe longer if there are complications. We can't hide a fugitive slave for that long, Rebecca said. Her owner is probably already looking for her. He'll trace her here eventually. Then we need to buy time, Crane said. They crafted a careful lie. When questioned by authorities, they claimed Hannah was a free woman Crane had hired from Charleston, not a fugitive. They produced false papers, documents forged by William, the Underground Railroad conductor who'd helped them before. For 2 weeks, the deception worked. Hannah gave birth to a healthy baby boy, and she began to recover her strength. But then Hannah's owner, a Georgia planter named Samuel Griffith, arrived in South Carolina with a federal marshal and paperwork proving Hannah was his property and demanding her return under the Fugitive Slave Act. The confrontation happened on Fairhaven's front lawn, with most of the plantation's people watching. That woman is my property, Griffith said, pointing at Hannah, who stood on the porch holding her newborn son. I have legal documentation proving ownership. Federal law requires you to return her and her child to me immediately. Hannah is a free woman, Crane said, showing the forged papers. She's employed by me. Your documentation must be referring to someone else. The marshal examined both sets of papers. These freedom papers look suspicious. Mr. Crane, I believe you're harboring a fugitive. I believe you're mistaken, Crane replied calmly. There's one way to settle this, Griffith said. Hannah, tell them the truth. Are you a runaway slave from my plantation in Georgia? Hannah looked at Abigail, then at her baby, then at the crowd of people watching. She knew that lying would make things worse if she was caught, but telling the truth meant returning to slavery, and condemning her son to be born into slavery as well. Before Hannah could answer, Abigail stepped forward. Don't answer that. Under South Carolina law, you have the right to. She has no rights, Griffith interrupted. She's a slave. And you, miss, should remember your place. You're a free negress, but that doesn't give you authority to interfere in white men's business. Abigail felt the familiar anger rise, the anger at being dismissed, at being told to know her place, at watching injustice unfold while being powerless to stop it. But she controlled herself and tried a different approach. "Mr. Griffith, what if we purchase Hannah and her child? Name your price. We'll buy them from you and manumit them legally. Everyone wins." Griffith laughed coldly. "I don't sell to Northern sympathizers who'll just free them. That defeats the entire purpose of the Fugitive Slave Act. No, Hannah comes back to Georgia with me. And if you attempt to prevent that, I'll have all of you arrested for violating federal law." The marshal stepped forward. "Mr. Crane, I'm giving you 1 hour to produce Hannah and her child for return to Mr. Griffith. If you don't comply, I'll arrest you, Miss Freeman, and anyone else who interferes. The Fugitive Slave Act is federal law. It supersedes your personal feelings about slavery." After they left to wait out the hour at a local inn, the Fairhaven community gathered urgently. "We can't let them take her," one of the workers said. "We can't let that baby be born into slavery. But if we resist, they'll arrest Miss Abigail and Mr. Crane," another pointed out. "They'll shut down Fairhaven. Everything we've built will be destroyed." "So what do we do?" someone asked. Everyone looked at Abigail. She'd become the community's de facto leader, the person they turned to in crisis. Abigail thought about the choice before them. Comply with the law and betray Hannah and her child. Or break the law and risk everything they'd built at Fairhaven. It was an impossible choice. But as she looked at Hannah holding her newborn son, Abigail realized there was only one choice she could make and still live with herself. "We don't give her up," Abigail said firmly. "We fight. We resist. And if they want to arrest us, let them. Because some things are worth going to prison for. Freedom is one of those things." "They'll destroy Fairhaven," Rebecca warned. "Then Fairhaven will be destroyed standing for something that matters," Abigail replied. "We've spent 2 years proving that enslaved people can be treated with dignity. Now we prove that we'll fight for their freedom, even when it costs us everything." Crane looked at Abigail with admiration and fear. "You're sure about this?" "I'm sure," Abigail said. When the marshal returned with Griffith after an hour, they found Fairhaven's gates closed and locked. Every able-bodied person on the plantation stood in a line in front of the gates, creating a human barrier. "Last chance, Mr. Crane," the marshal called. "Open these gates and produce the fugitive, or I start making arrests." "We will not comply with an unjust law," Crane called back. "Hannah is under our protection. If you want to take her, you'll have to go through all of us." The marshal hesitated. He was one man with a federal warrant, facing nearly 50 people who'd made clear they were willing to fight. He needed reinforcements. "I'll be back with a militia," the marshal said. "And when I return, everyone who resists will be arrested. You're all committing federal crimes." After they left, the community had perhaps 6 hours before the marshal returned with armed men. They used that time to prepare. "We can't win a battle against a militia," Isaiah pointed out. "Even armed, we're outmatched." "Then we don't fight a battle," Abigail said. "We stage a resistance. We make it as difficult as possible for them to take Hannah without actually getting people killed. We buy time." "Time for what?" Rebecca asked. "Time for Hannah to escape," Abigail said. She turned to William, the Underground Railroad conductor who'd arrived to help. "Can you get Hannah and her baby out tonight? Before the militia arrives?" "If we leave now, maybe," William said. "But it's risky with a newborn. The baby could cry, could get sick. And the roads are being watched." "Risk it anyway," Hannah said. She'd been silent until now, but her voice was firm. "I won't let my son grow up enslaved. I won't let these people be arrested because of me. Get us out tonight." They made the plan quickly. William would take Hannah and the baby north through back roads, avoiding main routes. Meanwhile, Fairhaven's people would stage a resistance when the militia arrived, making it look like Hannah was still there, buying time for her to get away. At midnight, Hannah and her son left Fairhaven hidden in William's wagon. Abigail said goodbye to them at the gate. "Thank you," Hannah said, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for risking everything for me and my child." "Get to freedom," Abigail said. "Live well. Raise your son to know he's free. That's all the thanks I need." The militia arrived at dawn, 30 armed men led by the marshal and Griffith. They found Fairhaven's gates still locked and the community still standing in defiant resistance. "This is your final warning," the marshal shouted. "Open the gates and surrender the fugitive, or we'll use force." "We do not surrender," Crane called back. The militia broke down the gates and flooded onto the property. They searched every building, every room, looking for Hannah. They found nothing. Griffith was enraged. "Where is she? Where's my property?" "I have no idea," Crane said honestly. "Perhaps she's escaped." "You helped her escape," Griffith accused. "You're all guilty of violating the Fugitive Slave Act." The marshal arrested Crane and Abigail on the spot. Rebecca, as an accomplice, was also arrested. They were taken to Charleston to face federal charges. The arrest of the 3 leaders left Fairhaven vulnerable. Without Crane's legal ownership and Abigail's management, the plantation fell into chaos. The neighboring planters, seeing an opportunity, moved to seize control of the property and re-enslave the people there under harsher conditions. "This is what happens when you challenge the natural order," Harrison Webb proclaimed. Fairhaven was an aberration, and now it's being corrected. In Charleston's jail, awaiting trial, Abigail, Crane, and Rebecca faced the reality of what their resistance had cost them. "We're going to prison," Rebecca said quietly. "For years, probably. And Fairhaven will be destroyed. Everyone there will suffer because of our choices." "We made the right choice," Crane said firmly. "We couldn't hand Hannah and her baby over to slavery. But was it worth this cost?" Rebecca asked. "Was saving one woman worth losing everything?" Abigail thought about the question. She thought about Hannah and her son, hopefully making their way to freedom. She thought about the Fairhaven community, about to face harsh conditions again. She thought about the 2 years of work, about to be undone. "Yes," Abigail said finally. "It was worth it. Because if we'd surrendered Hannah, we'd have betrayed everything Fairhaven stood for. We'd have proven that when faced with real choice between law and justice, we'd choose law. That would have made everything we built a lie. So we go to prison with our principles intact," Rebecca said. "We go to prison knowing we did right," Abigail corrected. "And we trust that somehow, the truth of what we've done will matter. That Fairhaven's example will inspire others, even if Fairhaven itself doesn't survive." But unknown to them, forces were already moving to help. Judge Blackwell, the jurist who'd helped them before, was working behind the scenes. And Hannah herself, safely arrived in Pennsylvania, was telling her story to Northern abolitionist organizations, a story that would make Fairhaven famous and create pressure for the prisoner's release. The forbidden mystery of the plantation master who worshipped his slave was about to be revealed in ways no one expected. And the truth, when it emerged, would change everything. The trial of Nathaniel Crane, Abigail Freeman, and Rebecca Morrison began in Charleston in September 1840, and it immediately became a national sensation. Northern newspapers sent reporters to cover the case of 3 people being prosecuted for refusing to return a fugitive slave. Southern newspapers covered it as proof that Northern interference in Southern affairs was criminal. And abolitionists organized protests outside the courthouse, demanding the defendants' release. The prosecution's case was straightforward: Crane, Freeman, and Morrison had knowingly harbored a fugitive slave and facilitated her escape in violation of the Fugitive Slave Act. They had documentary evidence, witness testimony, and the defendant's own admission that they'd refused to surrender Hannah. The defense, led by Judge Blackwell who'd come out of semi-retirement to represent them, argued something more complex. that the Fugitive Slave Act itself was unconstitutional, that natural law and human rights superseded federal statute, and that the defendants had acted according to conscience and moral necessity. These three people stand accused of helping a mother and newborn child escape slavery, Blackwell told the jury in his opening statement. Yes, they broke a law. But throughout history, some laws have been so unjust that breaking them is a moral imperative. Slavery is such an evil. And the Fugitive Slave Act, which requires citizens to participate in that evil, is such an unjust law. The prosecution objected that the morality of slavery wasn't on trial, only whether the defendants had violated federal law. The judge sustained the objection, ruling that the jury must consider only the legal question, not the moral one. But Blackwell found ways to introduce the moral dimension anyway. He called witnesses who described Fairhaven, how it operated, how workers were treated, how it proved slavery's brutality wasn't necessary for Southern agriculture. He introduced evidence of the plantation's profitability despite treating enslaved people with dignity. And he put Abigail on the stand to tell her story. Abigail's testimony lasted an entire day. She described her childhood as an enslaved person, the brutality she'd witnessed and experienced, her education and eventual freedom. She talked about Fairhaven and the vision behind it, to prove that human dignity and economic success weren't incompatible. And she talked about Hannah. I looked at that woman, exhausted, pregnant, desperate, and I saw myself at 18, Abigail testified. I saw someone who'd risked everything for freedom, who'd walked for weeks through dangerous territory because slavery was worse than any danger she might face escaping it. How could I turn her away? How could I send her back to the man who owned her, knowing he'd punish her brutally for running? The law required it, the prosecutor said. The law is wrong, Abigail replied. A law that requires me to participate in someone's enslavement is a law I cannot in good conscience follow. I'd rather go to prison for defying it than live free while complying with evil. Her words were reported in newspapers across the country. And they resonated with people, particularly in the North, where anti-slavery sentiment was growing. But it was what happened next that truly changed the case. On the fourth day of the trial, a woman entered the courtroom and asked permission to address the court. She was black, carrying a baby, and she identified herself as Hannah Williams, the fugitive slave at the center of the case. The courtroom erupted in shock. Hannah was supposed to be safely in Pennsylvania, far from reach of Southern law. Why had she returned to South Carolina, where she could be captured and re-enslaved? I came back because I heard these good people were being prosecuted for helping me, Hannah said. And I couldn't let them suffer for my freedom. I'm here to testify about what really happened, and to offer myself in exchange for their release. Judge Blackwell tried to object, to protect Hannah from effectively surrendering herself. But Hannah was determined. She took the stand and told her story, about years of brutal treatment on the Georgia plantation, about being raped repeatedly by the overseer, about learning she was pregnant and knowing her child would be born into the same slavery she'd endured. About making the desperate decision to run, knowing she might die trying but certain that staying meant a living death. These people at Fairhaven saved my life and my son's life, Hannah testified. They didn't force me to stay. They didn't harbor me against my will. They simply refused to send me back to hell. Is that a crime? If so, then the law itself is criminal. The prosecutor cross-examined Hannah, trying to establish that she was indeed the property of Samuel Griffith and that Fairhaven had knowingly harbored a fugitive. But Hannah's testimony was devastating in its emotional impact. Jurors were seen wiping away tears. Spectators openly wept. Then came the revelation that changed everything. During Hannah's testimony, a man in the back of the courtroom stood up. He was elderly, perhaps 70, well-dressed and distinguished-looking. He identified himself as Reverend Thomas Griffith, Samuel Griffith's father. I need to speak, Reverend Griffith said. I need to tell the truth about something my son has hidden. Samuel Griffith, the plantation owner who pursued Hannah to South Carolina, tried to object. But the judge, intrigued, allowed Reverend Griffith to approach. What the elderly minister revealed shocked everyone in the courtroom. "Hannah is my granddaughter," Reverend Griffith said. "Her mother was an enslaved woman on my plantation. I had a relationship with her. Sinful, wrong, but I convinced myself it was acceptable because I owned her. Hannah was the result." He looked at his son Samuel with disgust. "When Hannah was born, my son, her half-brother, knew the truth. But he kept her enslaved anyway. And when she got older, when she became a woman, he allowed his overseer to abuse her. His own half-sister, and he treated her like property because acknowledging their relationship would have been inconvenient." The courtroom was silent, stunned. "I've stayed quiet for years, allowing this evil to continue," Reverend Griffith continued. "But I can't stay quiet anymore. Hannah is my blood. That baby she's holding is my great-grandson. And they deserve freedom, not enslavement by their own family." He turned to the judge. "I'm here to purchase my granddaughter and her child from my son, and to immediately emancipate them. I should have done this years ago. I'm doing it now." Samuel Griffith was furious. "You can't do this. She's my property. You have no right." "I have every right," his father interrupted. "I'm your father and a stakeholder in the plantation. The law allows me to purchase slaves from the estate I helped build. And that's what I'm doing." The legal technicalities were complex, but Judge Blackwell worked with Reverend Griffith's lawyers to execute the purchase and manumission papers right there in the courtroom. Within hours, Hannah and her son were legally free, no longer fugitives, but free people protected by law. With Hannah no longer a fugitive slave, the prosecution's case collapsed. There was no longer anyone to be returned under the Fugitive Slave Act. The charges against Crane, Abigail, and Rebecca were dropped. But the trial had accomplished something more important than securing the defendant's freedom. It had exposed the truth about the plantation master who'd enslaved his own sister, about the family relationships destroyed by slavery, about the moral bankruptcy of a system that reduced even blood relatives to property. "This is what slavery does," Blackwell said in his closing remarks. "It corrupts every relationship, destroys every bond, makes monsters of men who might otherwise be decent." Reverend Griffith's confession shows us the truth. Slavery is an evil so profound that it turns brothers against sisters, fathers against daughters, humanity against itself. After the trial, Crane, Abigail, and Rebecca returned to Fairhaven expecting to find it destroyed. Instead, they found it transformed. During their imprisonment, the enslaved people at Fairhaven had organized themselves. Led by Isaiah, they'd continued operating the plantation, maintaining the buildings, working the fields. They'd resisted the neighboring planters' attempts to take control. And they'd created something remarkable, a self-governing community that functioned even without white oversight. "We couldn't let what you built be destroyed," Isaiah told them. "You taught us we were capable, that we deserved dignity. We proved it by keeping Fairhaven running while you were gone." The trial's publicity had another effect. It brought attention and support from Northern abolitionists. Donations poured in to support Fairhaven. Volunteers arrived to help with operations. And most importantly, sympathetic lawyers began working on a plan to gradually purchase and free all the enslaved people at Fairhaven. The process took 5 years. But by 1845, everyone at Fairhaven was legally free. Some chose to stay and work the land as paid employees. Others left to start new lives elsewhere. But all of them carried forward the lessons they'd learned, that dignity was a right, not a privilege, and that standing up for justice, even at great cost, was worth doing. Hannah and her son, whom she named Nathaniel in honor of Crane, settled in Boston. She became an active member of the abolitionist movement, telling her story at churches and meetings, raising awareness about slavery's cruelty. Reverend Griffith, racked with guilt over years of moral failure, devoted his remaining years to abolition work. He emancipated all the enslaved people on his plantation, sold the land, and used the proceeds to support Underground Railroad operations. Samuel Griffith, publicly shamed by the trial revelations, lost most of his wealth and influence. He died bitter and alone, a cautionary tale about how slavery corrupted even those who benefited from it. Rebecca Morrison became a prominent abolitionist, using her position as a white Southern woman to challenge slavery from within the South. She wrote articles, gave speeches, and worked tirelessly to convince other plantation owners to manumit their enslaved people. And Nathaniel Crane and Abigail Freeman continued their partnership for the rest of their lives. They never married. Interracial marriage was illegal and socially impossible. But their relationship transcended traditional categories. They were partners, friends, and the deepest of companions. "People say I worship you," Crane told Abigail one evening years later, after Fairhaven had become a thriving free community. "Maybe I do. But not because of your race or in spite of it. I respect you because of who you are, your courage, your intelligence, your moral clarity. You taught me to see the world differently. That's worth any worship." "I don't want worship," Abigail replied. "I want partnership. I want to keep building what we started. I want to prove that freedom and dignity aren't just ideals but practical realities that create better lives for everyone." When the Civil War came in 1861, Fairhaven became a center of support for the Union cause. Many of the formerly enslaved people who'd lived there joined colored regiments to fight for freedom. The plantation became a stop on the Underground Railroad, helping hundreds of people escape to freedom before the war ended slavery entirely. Abigail died in 1872 at age 64, having lived to see slavery abolished and her life's work vindicated. Her funeral was attended by hundreds, black and white, former slaves and free people, all whose lives she'd touched. Crane died 2 years later, having spent his final years establishing schools for freed people throughout the South. He was buried beside Abigail in Fairhaven Cemetery, their graves marked with simple stones bearing their names and a shared inscription, "Partners in the fight for justice." Together they proved that conscience matters more than law, that dignity is every person's right, and that courage can change the world. The story of Fairhaven became legend in abolitionist circles and later in civil rights movements. It was proof that individuals could resist systemic evil, that moral courage could achieve what seemed impossible, that standing up for what's right, even at tremendous cost, ultimately mattered. The forbidden mystery of the plantation master who worshipped his slave was finally understood. It wasn't worship at all, but respect between equals who'd found partnership despite a system designed to make such partnership impossible. It was the story of two people who challenged slavery not through violence but through example, proving that dignity and freedom created better outcomes for everyone. And it was the story of ordinary people, Hannah risking death for her child's freedom, Isaiah leading community resistance, Rebecca choosing conscience over comfort, Judge Blackwell using his position to defend justice, all of them proving that in the face of great evil, courage and compassion could prevail. In 1920, a historical marker was placed at Fairhaven, which had become a small town of free black landowners and farmers. The marker read, "On this site stood Fairhaven Plantation, where from 1838 to 1861, Nathaniel Crane and Abigail Freeman proved that human dignity and economic success were compatible, that slavery was unnecessary, and that ordinary people standing up for justice could change the world. Their courage in the face of legal prosecution, social ostracism, and economic pressure inspired the abolitionist movement and contributed to slavery's eventual end. Let their example remind us that some evils require resistance, that some laws deserve defiance, and that standing for what's right is always worth the cost." The forbidden mystery wasn't forbidden anymore. The truth was known. And that truth, that ordinary people armed with courage and conviction can challenge even the most entrenched evil, endures still, inspiring everyone who hears the story of the plantation master and the freed woman who together proved that justice is possible when people dare to fight for it.